Good day, everyone, and welcome to our introduction for the 20th session in our study of the book of Revelation. There's only 4 more to go after this one, and then we'll be moving on with the good work that Bob Capitini has done with studying the Holy Spirit. We don't know whether that'll be live or we'll be continuing to do it this way yet, but Bob's done a tremendous amount of really good work in preparation for that course. Let us begin with prayer. Jesus, during your ministry on earth, you showed your power and caring by healing people of all ages and stations in life from physical, mental, and spiritual ailments. Be present now to people who need your loving touch because of the coronavirus. May they feel your power of healing through the care of their doctors and nurses. Take away the fear, anxiety, and feelings of isolation from people receiving treatment or under quarantine. Give them a sense of purpose in pursuing health and protecting others from exposure to this disease. Protect their families and friends and bring peace to all who know them and love them. Amen. So I hope you're all doing well. I hope everybody is healthy. Nina and I continue to live in quarantine and trying to go out as little as we can. And I just want to say to everyone, we're making phone calls to everyone in the congregation. If you need some help, if you need someone to talk to, you give me a call or give one of the other clergy a call, and we'll be happy to do or try to take care of whatever your needs are. This week's lesson is a continuation of Revelation and music, and it focuses on the great African-American culture and their spirituals. They looked at Revelation in a very positive way because of the New Jerusalem we find at the end of Revelation, that it provides eternal hope. And hope is something that they need and something that we need today as well. One of the great spiritualists was a woman by the name of Sojourner Truth. Great name, right? Okay. She campaigned for against slavery, and she was a lay preacher. Her favorite hymn was a hymn called Holy City, and it was about the New Jerusalem. Bob has done a really nice job of including the lyrics in here for it. Many of these spiritual songs were passed down orally through the oral tradition, and there weren't really lyrics on them. As a matter of fact, if you search for them today, you'll find different lyrics in different translations. But they all had one thing in common, and it was about hope for the future. We might want to look at those songs today ourselves about hope and the hope that Jesus brings us and even the book of Revelation. So thanks for tuning in. We'll be here every week, 4 more weeks for this course. The notes are excellent. You should have the handouts for lesson 20. And with that, I'll say goodbye. God bless. And if you need me, don't hesitate to call. Even if you just want to chat, that would be great. Bye.
Welcome back to our series on Revelation and its impact on Western culture. In the last lecture, we looked at the way that images from Revelation took musical form in Europe and North America. And I want to continue doing this in this lecture, where our focus will be more specifically on African American culture of the 19th and 20th centuries. As I mentioned last time, I find that music has given the language and imagery of Revelation some of its most enduring forms. My experience has been that people who know some of the songs that are based on Revelation find it enriching to learn where the imagery came from. And the reverse is also true. As we look at the songs the apocalypse has inspired, we can discover ways of understanding the book that we might never have discerned otherwise. As we turn now to African American culture, let me set a focus for our work by recalling one of the pivotal moments in more recent American history, and then looking back to the cultural and religious currents that led up to it. The moment that I'm referring to is the speech by Martin Luther King Jr., called "I Have a Dream." The speech was delivered at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. in 1963. It was 100 years after Lincoln had signed the Emancipation Proclamation, and it was the height of the Civil Rights Movement. King, of course, was a Black Baptist preacher, and he wove biblical themes together in his speech as he made a ringing call for social justice in America. You may remember that at the end of the speech, he referred to a song. He said that he envisioned the day when all people would sing in the words of the old spiritual, "Free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last." I mention this speech because it brings several things together so clearly. King refers to a spiritual, and the theme of the spiritual he quotes from is freedom. And even though one would expect the words of a song like that to be about purely spiritual things, King uses it in a way that shows the song's social and political implications. Now, the specific words that King quoted don't come from Revelation, but many spirituals do use themes from Revelation, and they have a similar quality. We expect the songs to be spiritual, and in a sense they are. They speak about the singer's hope for deliverance, for freedom, and ultimately for a better life in the presence of God. The songs describe scenes in which people wear white robes and golden crowns, and they walk along the golden streets of God's eternal city. So one would think that this hope is purely spiritual, a hope for freedom in the next life, not this one. But time and time again, the hopes that are voiced in the African American music have a way of bringing a sense of the future back into the present. They draw on hope for the next world as a source of encouragement for life in this world, and the effect can be powerful. The songs reinforce the sense that the future is ultimately open, not closed. That sense that things will be different in God's future can foster a spirit that resists being captive by the present. And in time, that spiritual resistance can lead to actions that seek to change life in the present. That was certainly evident in King's speech. Now, I make this point because there have been debates about how to take some of the heavenly imagery in this music. Some have assumed that all the emphasis on heavenly things was originally a way to foster acceptance of the status quo, even when that was deeply unfair. The idea is that in the time of slavery, African Americans were given a heavy dose of heavenly hope in order to make sure they were willing to put up with their bondage in the here and now. In other words, they were not supposed to look for anything better in this life, since they could hope for improvements in the next life. But that perspective has been challenged by those who've seen how hope for the future can foster spiritual resistance in the present, and that spiritual resistance can, in turn, inspire social change. Let me go back and explore this interplay between hope and social change in the story of Sojourner Truth. She was one of the most famous African American women of the 19th century. She was active in the campaigns for women's rights and for the abolition of slavery. And she was also a lay preacher, whose favorite hymn centered on Revelation's New Jerusalem. So it's worth asking how all that fit together. She was born a slave in New York State around 1797. At that time, slavery was still legal in New York. Her early life included beatings that left her arms scarred for life. When she fell in love with another slave, the man was beaten in order to end their relationship. Her owner made her marry another man with whom she had several children, but eventually she ran away. and found refuge with another family shortly before slavery was abolished in New York. In 1827, she had a spiritual experience in which she had a vivid sense of the presence of Jesus. This heightened spiritual awareness eventually led her to a gathering of local Methodists, where she soon learned the hymn that would become her favorite. The usual practice at these gatherings was that the preacher sang one line of the song, and the rest of the group repeated it after him. That allowed everyone to learn the words, including Sojourner Truth. What the hymn did was to describe two contrasting realities. One was the vision of God's city, which was filled with light. The other was the reality of human suffering. And by putting these together, the song moves people through the experience of suffering in the knowledge that it does not define the future. There is something more. The hymn begins with some classic images from Revelation. There is a holy city, a happy world above, beyond the starry regions built by the God of love. An everlasting temple and saints arrayed in white. There serve their great Redeemer. They dwell with him in light. The words about the holy city where people dwell with God in light are inspired by Revelation's description of the New Jerusalem. And the image of the saints serving God in white robes recalls a scene in Revelation chapter 7. The hymn writer will elaborate the themes from these chapters in subsequent verses, which speak of God wiping away sorrow and the heavenly elders bowing down in worship. But where the song really does serious business is when it says that those who share in this future are brought through tribulation. The song speaks of suffering as a reality and identifies God as the one who brings people through it to a future filled with life. Affliction had certainly been Sojourner Truth's experience. And this song recognizes that if affliction is what defines a person's future, then the natural response is despair. So the song counters with images from Revelation that open up a different future, a light-filled future, in which even those at the bottom of the social ladder will wear the white, clean robes that give people dignity. And this promise for the future gives the singers incentive to persevere in the present. Now, I mentioned that some have wondered whether these hopeful images simply lead people to a life of quiet acceptance of the status quo. And here's where Sojourner Truth is so interesting. It was at this time in her life that she not only latched on to this musical version of Revelation, but was also making legal history, although she didn't know it. She was about to become the first African American woman to win a case against a white man in court. What happened was that the man who owned her son had illegally sold the boy to an owner in the South. And when Sojourner Truth learned about it, she pressed charges against the slave owner. So while she was learning to sing about God's radiant city, she was also going to going to the local courthouse in order to free her son from slavery. And she won the case. So as she continued on a career dedicated to social reform, she continued to sing about Revelation's holy city. Now, thus far, I've focused on a song that had its origins in the white community, though Sojourner Truth certainly made it her own. But now I want to explore the musical forms that were created by the African Americans themselves. The classic form, of course, is the spiritual, which was connected to the slave communities in the American South. Now, songs of this type were created orally. The slaves would make them up in the context of prayer meetings that they held among themselves. This oral quality makes the spirituals challenging to study because the lyrics and melodies kept evolving as they were passed along from one group of singers to the next. And that process of change has continued down to the present. So as I was preparing this lecture, I realized that some of you may have heard lyrics that are different from the ones I will quote. So to make sure there's no confusion, I want you to know that my main source is a collection called Slave Songs of the United States, which was published in 1867. That collection is old enough to give us a good sense of the lyrics that were actually used by the slaves in the mid-1800s. Let me begin with a song that's called There's a Meetin' Here Tonight. The title helps us picture the setting of the song. On most plantations, the slaves held their own religious meetings, usually outdoors. The most common time was on Sunday night, but they also gathered on other nights of the week, and the meetings went on for hours. There was singing and dancing, and sometimes one of the slaves would preach a sermon to the group. What I find interesting about this song is that it tells us where the message might come from at this meeting. Here's what the first verse says. I take my text in Matthew and by the revelation. I know you by your garment. There's a meetin' here tonight. It's intriguing to note that the song mentions two biblical books, Matthew and Revelation. And the prospect of hearing a message from Revelation apparently gave people special incentive to come to the meeting. So it's worth asking why. People have sometimes noted that the images of the apocalypse may seem more at home in the world of the slaves than they did in the white churches. You see, one of the currents that shaped the religious outlook of the slaves came from their West African heritage. Those African traditions placed a great deal of emphasis on the spirit, and this sense of spiritual immediacy continued to shape the outlook of the slaves who embraced Christianity. The idea that people could be caught up in the Spirit of God and have visions and ecstatic experiences was all a normal part of religious life for them. So if the author of Revelation said that he was caught up in the Spirit or saw visions, this fit with the slave's own experience. One slave owner sputtered that wherever you meet a slave preacher, it's likely that he's seen sundry miraculous visions equal to those of John on the Isle of Patmos. To the slave owner, this was outrageous. To the slaves, such spiritual experience was a source of authority, and Revelation fit well within that worldview. Another aspect of Revelation that was appealing was the ease with which it moved from the earthly world to the heavenly one, and from the present age into the future. For the slaves, that ease of movement was freeing, and you can see it in their songs. Scholars have often commented that when you hear the spirituals, you can't always be sure if the words are about hope for a better life in heaven or a better life on earth, and if the freedom they're talking about has more to do with this life or the next. When we analyze things, we usually want the data to fit into predictable categories. Either something is past, present, or future. Either it's heavenly or it's earthly. But those who've studied American slave culture have noted that the people who dream of deliverance from suffering rarely put those dreams into neat packages. Let me explore the way the New Jerusalem vision is related to a hope for freedom that involves both the next world and this world. The New Jerusalem is, of course, the climax of the book of Revelation. That's where the struggle against evil is over. Suffering is ended. Death is gone. And people are invited into the radiant presence of God where the tree of life is found. One of the spirituals that draws on this scene is called Blow Your Trumpet, Gabriel. It begins, the tallest tree in paradise, the Christians call the tree of life. And I hope that trump might blow me home to the New Jerusalem. And the chorus repeats the themes by saying, blow your trumpet, Gabriel, blow louder, louder. And I hope that trump might blow me home to the New Jerusalem. On one level, All of this seems otherworldly. The New Jerusalem is where people will go in the future. According to Revelation, people enter the city after they've died and been resurrected to everlasting life. That futuristic sense is also suggested by Gabriel and his trumpet. That detail isn't mentioned in Revelation, but other New Testament passages do refer to the last trumpet that will signal the resurrection of the dead at the end of the age. But what's so much fun about this song is the way it transforms the imagery into something almost whimsical. You see, the singer wants Gabriel to change things for the better with a blast on his horn. He wants Gabriel to blow me home to the New Jerusalem. Death doesn't seem to be the issue here. Rather, the hope is that the singer will be whisked away from life in the present to that wonderful place called home. That's what New Jerusalem becomes. The place one feels at home. So is that home purely otherworldly? There certainly is a spiritual dimension to it. Yet you might also be able to see that the singer gets a taste of it even on this side of heaven, if he comes to a place where he might truly feel like he belongs. I also wonder about the song's interest in the tree of life. You remember that the first line said that the tallest tree in paradise the Christians call the tree of life. And that, of course, fits with Revelation's description of the New Jerusalem. So in a technical sense, we should expect the singer to be thinking about something in the next world. That's where the tree of life will be found. It's part of the new creation, and you reach it through death and resurrection. But in the world of the spirituals, the tree of life had a tendency not to stay put. It easily became a metaphor for the opportunities that made for a better life wherever that was to be found, whether in this world or the next. The slaves who sang songs like this were confined by a social system from which many saw little chance of escape. Yet the songs kept pressing the imagination beyond the confines of the present, and they kept evoking scenes of a different future. So even in the context of social and legal bondage, the music and its apocalyptic imagery kept fostering a sense of spiritual freedom that gave encouragement for life in the here and now. That song about Gabriel whisking somebody away to the New Jerusalem sounds innocent enough. But as we turn to the story of a similar spiritual, we can see how, for some people, the ambiguous, otherworldly imagery could seem dangerously close to life in this world. I'm referring to the song called "My Father, How Long?" This was a spiritual that had been sung for many years in slave communities. But at the beginning of the American Civil War, some people were put in jail for singing it. It was viewed as a subversive song because its otherworldly imagery too easily lent itself to supporting the quest for freedom in this world. And the outbreak of the war made that seem to be a real threat. The song starts off innocently enough by asking, "My Father, how long, my Father, how long, my Father, how long this poor sinner suffer here?" The refrain gives a word of hope by repeating that it won't be long that they must suffer here. And the verses that follow certainly seem otherworldly when they speak of the Lord calling the singers home so they can walk the golden streets of the New Jerusalem. But the way the song includes the words, "We will soon be free," blurs the line between the future and the present, and it's not clear that the New Jerusalem is purely about the next life. You see, if New Jerusalem equals freedom, then people might look for a taste of New Jerusalem wherever freedom is created. And in a tangible sense, that would mean release from slavery. It's interesting that the version of the song that was published in the late 1860s actually includes a final verse that says, "We'll fight for liberty when the Lord will call us home." That shows how readily hope for the next world gave incentive to bring change in this world when the war broke out. I've been focusing on the New Jerusalem theme in the slave culture of the early and mid-19th century. But the theme also played a role in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In the South, slavery had ended, but segregation persisted, and with it there was continued poverty and a sense of being excluded from opportunities for social advancement. In that same period, thousands of blacks moved from the rural South to the cities of the North. They were looking for better conditions there. Some found work, others did not, and even in the North it proved difficult to find the opportunities people had hoped for. Yet in the northern cities, the black churches remained important centers of community life, and the musical traditions also developed there until they produced what we think of as the gospel sound, with its tight harmonies and sense of driving rhythm. Typically, the voices dominate this music, with piano giving accompaniment in the background. In the new context, the old lyrics about the city of God took on a new vitality for people who were actually living in major cities. And even when urban life fell far short of the vision of Revelation, the music helped keep a sense of hope alive. One of the older spirituals that became a popular gospel number was called "Oh, What a Beautiful City." And you can see how this song could be an almost militant affirmation of hope in the face of dispiriting conditions. It starts off by repeating the line, "Oh, what a beautiful city," several times. And then it makes clear that there are 12 gates to the city, just like in Revelation. The gates are all about access in Revelation and in this song. The gospel tune lists the gates as Revelation does. There are 3 gates in at the east and 3 in at the west, 3 in at the north and 3 in at the south, making that 12 gates to the city. Alleluia. The theme of this song is access, and these 12 gates beckon people into a life in God's city. By the time you get to the last verse, the song says, "When I get to heaven, I'm going to sing and shout. Ain't nobody up there going to take me out, because God built 12 gates to the city." Alleluia. Can you see how that promise of access to God's city overturns that sense of exclusion that was common in many earthly cities? It was a way of keeping a restless hope alive. It insisted that God had a place for the singers that no one else could take away. You can see how this vision of God's city would foster a sense of spiritual freedom and dignity that would eventually help inspire efforts to bring about greater freedom and dignity in the cities of this world. Now, there's one final dimension of the apocalyptic imagery that I want to consider here, and that's the theme of cosmic judgment. The African American tradition sometimes weaves those images together with images of hope. You remember that Revelation includes visions of the sun turning black as sackcloth and the moon becoming red as blood. It shows the stars falling from the sky and the earth shaking as the great day of judgment approaches. What's interesting to ask is whether this prospect of cosmic judgment is bad news or good news. And the surprising answer is that it depends. For those who are doing rather well, then the prospect of cosmic change will inevitably seem bad. If things are fine for you at the moment, then having your world shaken up will certainly bring a loss. But things may look quite different to those who feel like they've got nothing to lose, since they're already at the bottom. From their perspective, the current order of things is oppressive, and shaking things up creates the possibility of a better life on the other side. You can see this sense of cosmic change bringing hope in some of the spirituals that I mentioned earlier. But probably the most influential rendition of this comes to us in the form of jazz. Dixieland jazz, which was developed by African American musicians in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The most famous Dixieland number ever done was originally an apocalyptic vision of cosmic judgment and hope. And here's what it sounds like. People everywhere know a few lines of "Oh, When the Saints Go Marching In." But not so many remember that this song originated as a musical rendition of the Apocalypse. You see, after the song pictures all those saints marching in, it goes on to say, "And when the sun refused to shine, and when the sun refused to shine, Lord, how I want to be in that number, when the sun refused to shine." And in the verse after that, it takes up the theme of the moon turning to blood. And so with these verses, you've got all the apocalyptic fireworks you could want. But the genius of the song is that it connects these cosmic images of judgment, which appear in Revelation chapter 6, with the vision of the saints in glory, which appears in Revelation chapter 7. That's the chapter that pictures an angel interrupting the movement towards cosmic judgment so that he can seal people for life with God. And Revelation says that John hears their number. The number is first listed as 144,000, but it actually turns out to be a great multitude. And that's the crowd that finds life with God, even when the sun refuses to shine. You can see why people would want to be in that number, with the world around undergoing cosmic change. And the traditional lyrics keep going with the apocalyptic imagery right down to the new creation at the end of Revelation. The song says, "Some say this world of trouble is the only one we need, but I'm waiting for that morning when the new world is revealed." And in Revelation, that new world is where the nations come streaming in to the New Jerusalem. This musical rendition of the Apocalypse originally became popular as a funeral march. Many of the blacks who lived in New Orleans in the early 19th century had their roots in the culture of West Africa, where funerals were a big deal. In West Africa, there were secret societies that helped ensure that their members were given honorable burials. And this tradition continued in North America. Free blacks formed their own societies, whose duties included providing decent funerals. And the number of these societies grew after slavery was abolished. Part of the funeral custom was a procession from the church to the cemetery and then back to town again. This was the era in which brass bands were becoming very popular. And so the bands got hired to provide music for these processions. On the way out to the cemetery, they would play something slow and somber. But then on the way back from the cemetery, they'd do something upbeat. And the song, "Oh, When the Saints Go Marching In," was a favorite song for processions both ways. The bands would play this musical apocalypse slowly on the way to the cemetery, and then do an upbeat version on the way back to town. It was a song that could help turn grief into joy. People liked it so much that it became popular at the jazz clubs, and it was finally Louis Armstrong who established it as the definitive Dixieland number. So what do you think? Does this jazz version of the Apocalypse capture the true spirit of the book? I'll leave that for you to decide. And I'll also invite you back for the next lecture, in which we'll see how the apocalyptic rhetoric of Revelation helped intensify calls for social change in America until things finally reached the breaking point and then went beyond.